In this video, I'd like to present the consensus view of how the Gospels came together in early Christianity, with a focus on Matthew and the sources he used to compile his Gospel. What were the earlier writings that he was in dialogue with? So here's our timeline again of the first century. You'll remember that the bright pink bar is Jesus' lifespan, sometime before the death of Herod, 6 BCE or so he was born, till about 29 or 30 of the Common Era. And the period of oral preaching overlaps with and continues on after Jesus' death to the present day. Our green bars above the timeline represent the Gospels. So on the same line, the first bar of Mark would be the earliest gospel. We saw the basic reason why last week. Its emphasis on suffering and the failure of the disciples seems to reflect a pastoral circumstance of suffering of the community and turmoil. And we know there was a lot of turmoil going on, not only in Israel, where there was a massive revolt against Rome and their temple was destroyed, but even within Rome itself. And the end of that process was a whole new dynasty of the Roman Empire because the old ones were falling apart around this time. So there was a lot of turmoil everywhere, and that seems to fit the themes of Mark's Gospel. Now, in a later video, I'll explain why we think Matthew and Luke are later. We'll see that Matthew largely copies Mark's Gospel, which we think to be the first one. So Matthew's Gospel embeds almost all of Mark, quite a bit of it. But he has a lot more material. Matthew's Gospel is a lot longer. And so presumably some of this extra material that Matthew has is not just something he invented or wrote to connect scenes. It's material he inherited from early Christian eyewitnesses of Jesus and other sources. Some of these traditions that Matthew incorporates almost seem to oppose or challenge some of the developments in the churches of Paul, the Apostle Paul, who writes so many letters. We'll be looking at his letters later in the course. They're often frequently read, of course, before the epistles, before the Gospels on Sunday and in the lectionary. I want to just give you one example of the sort of tension between what Matthew says and what Paul says. And I want us to think of this tension in terms of different, diverse Christian positions and teachings in this first century of Christianity. There was a debate about what mattered most about Jesus and where to take his teaching. And so here's an example of this. I'm going to put two columns up, one of a letter of Paul's and one of Matthew. So here's an example of Paul's writing in his letter to the Romans, chapter 3. We hear Paul say, "For we consider that a person is justified by faith apart from works of the law." In other words, nothing you do justifies you, only faith. Does God belong to Jews alone? Does he not belong to Gentiles too? Yes, also to Gentiles. For God is one and will justify the circumcised, that is the Jews, on the basis of faith, and the uncircumcised also through faith. Are we then annulling the law by this faith? Do you not have to follow ethics at all? Of course not. On the contrary, we're supporting the law. So you can see that Paul is advocating a position here that Jews will be nervous about, Jewish Christians will be nervous about, because he's saying that faith matters more than the law. And the Mosaic law was revealed by God. That was the center of their covenant. And Jesus, supports it too. Now, the question is, in the Gospels, in any given Gospel, how strongly does Jesus support the Jewish law? If we find, like we do in Matthew, that he supports it quite a bit, then this position is somewhat in tension with Paul saying it no longer matters as much. It's not being nullified, but it doesn't matter as much as faith. So let's look at what Matthew says. And go ahead and pause the video and read this for yourselves. I'll call out a few features after you've done that. This, of course, is the famous Sermon on the Mount. And right toward the beginning of it, Jesus says, "Don't think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not. I've not come to abolish them at all, but to fulfill them. That is, I'm going to deepen them, I'm going to strengthen them. Until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter, or even just a little decoration on a letter, will pass from the law until all these things take place." So there's a real strengthening here of the law and a connection of the law to the person of Jesus and to his ministry. That is in some tension with Paul. And so it's our first example of the fact that the New Testament, in giving us several different books, actually gives us several different forms of early Christianity. So Matthew's earlier sources and his own point of view seem to be in some tension with Paul. Who knows? Perhaps that's part of the reason he wanted to write his gospel, to make these points clear. So that's one possibility. But there's something else that's going on that we'll have a chance to take a look at in a subsequent video. And that is that while we don't think Matthew had the Gospel of Luke in front of him when he wrote his gospel, it just so happens that over 50 times there are passages that are in both Matthew and Luke, and they're almost identical. And the other weird thing about these shared items is that they're almost all sayings of Jesus. That is, they're not stories of walking on water or healing miracles or controversies with the Jews, the other Jews. They are statements of Jesus, parables, sayings. And so that's kind of interesting. Some people have wondered if there was a list of Jesus' sayings that circulated before Matthew and Luke ever wrote, and that when they sat down to write their Gospels, they might have had not only Mark, but this list of sayings. This shorthand for this list of sayings is Q, because the scholar who came up with the idea was German, and in his language, the word for source, which is what he wanted to call this saying source, is Quelle. It starts with a Q, and so Q became the letter for this hypothetical list of Jesus' sayings that Matthew might have used. So this begins to give us a picture of where Matthew is building his story from.